First, I'd just like to thank you all for coming out and coming to this event to hear about the torture letters. The project really means a lot to me. Really speaks to important issues about police violence in Chicago. Part of how the book is organized is around two central metaphors. One is the torture tree, and one is the black box of police torture. And through the torture tree metaphor, I try to explain how torture can be hidden in plain sight, how the nature of torture can grow, and how it can cast a large shadow on a city like Chicago. The black box was itself a torture device that was used to torture Chicago residents. But it is also something that I describe as the way in which knowledge about torture is concealed, the way in which information is hidden inside a black box. It's almost like a black hole where people refuse to look inside of after a while, and knowledge gets buried. And so through these central metaphors, I kind of talk about the predicament of torture throughout the book and how it is grown not only from Chicago, but also throughout the globe, where torturers from Chicago have traveled to places like Guantanamo Bay, and their techniques of torture have also traveled, and instruments of torture have also traveled. So I'm trying to trace the ways in which that happens and the implications of that happening. And so I want to read a little bit from the book, and I'll read from the epilogue before we get into a conversation with Ruben here. This is from the epilogue, which is called A Model for Justice. It begins, an open letter to you, the reader. You may be a curious reader who has stumbled on this title in a local bookstore, or a college student who has been assigned this book for a class. You may be a police or prison abolitionist who is drawn to critical books about law enforcement, or a civil rights attorney interested in fighting for racial equality. You may be a social scientist like myself, a victim of police violence, or a loved one of such a victim. Whatever your background is, and however you've come to read this book, if you believe that torture is not a necessary evil, but should be eradicated, and that torturers should be held accountable for their crimes, then the message of this letter is especially for you. I realize I haven't addressed you, the reader, directly until now, but part of the reason I've made my letters open is so that you can read them as well. If you read my other open letters, then you know that alongside the torture tree, a central metaphor herein is that of the black box. But there is one kind of black box that I've only mentioned in passing until now, and that is the black box as a recovery tool. Let me explain. When investigators arrive at the scene of an airplane crash, the first thing they search for, after survivors of course, is the black box. In this instance, the phrase refers to a device that records the audio from a cockpit and flight data. A typical model can record more than 100 hours of information. The box also includes a flight transponder that sends information back to air traffic controllers, insulated by armored steel that protects it from impact, fire, seawater. The black box is designed to provide an accurate record of the flight from takeoff to landing, or more importantly, to crash landing. It is tempting for us scholars to envision the research process as something like a black box recovery mission. Part of me would like to imagine myself as a crime scene investigator finding the black box of torture in the sea of denials, evasions, and lies. Ever since I learned that John Burge is rumored to actually have thrown his torture device into Lake Michigan from his boat named Vigilante. I wanted to be the one to find it. Perhaps not literally, but I have been searching for evidence that would tell me how torture happened in the past and why it continues to happen now. Civil rights lawyers probably dream about finding the incredible persuasive witness or the incontrovertible piece of evidence, the thing that stops a trial in its tracks, the thing that proves your client was a victim of, for example, a hate crime, that proves the presence of injustice. Well, for anthropologists like me, the desire to discover a supposedly hidden reality dates back to the founding of our discipline in the 1800s, when ethnographers made contact with people in remote parts of the world. What we find, however, is not like evidence in a trial. Instead, we often find aspects of social life that are so banal, most people don't deem them worthy of close study because everyone already believes them to be true. They only strike us ethnographers as interesting because the world in which we supposedly found them or discovered these things is different from our own. In Chicago, the belief that the police hate Black people and mistreat them, brutalize them, torture them, and kill them is so commonplace as to be banal. It's only surprising to the person who is unfamiliar with those communities of color, the person who lives somewhere else, or who simply does not care about what happens in these communities. Likewise, the idea that a social scientist could discover an aspect of police violence that Black Chicagoans didn't already know would be more than laughable. It would be insulting. The implication being that you were attempting to take credit for finding a struggle against police abuse that has been going on for over a century. I mentioned at the outset of this book that the reality of researching something that people already know had implications for how I conceived of this project. This is why, instead of trying to piece together the scene of an accident, I began from the premise that I would take what my interlocutors told me seriously. I would use their words and their thoughts to guide my project. And what they told me, again and again and again, was clear. Police torture is nothing like a plane crash. Police torture is not an accident at all. It is intentional, predictable, and expected. Most Chicagoans I talked to for this project already understood my subject better than I did. They knew that police torture had existed for a long time and that the city government had historically done little to stop it. I did not discover this phenomenon, far from it. What I have done, I hope, is clarify the shape and structure of police torture as a way to amplify the concerns of the people who have lived it. The torture tree is a concept that can help you visualize the range of police force, which we have called, in this book, the use of force continuum. I've shown that the torture tree has profound implications for how Chicagoans of color live. This is because it reinforces a racial caste system that subjects a disproportionate number of them to debilitation and death. It erodes the city government's legitimacy, and it makes not only Chicago, but the world less safe. Through my open letters in this book, I've also made clear that our country bears responsibility for the torture tree. This is because our collective investment in fear is what allows the torture tree to grow. If you have taken time to read my letters, you've put yourself in the shoes of future mayors of Chicago, youth of color in this city, the current superintendent of the police department, former police officers, civil rights activists, social justice advocates, victims of police violence, and torture survivors. You've imagined what it's like to be them and have grappled with their concerns. The purpose of writing open letters to the range of people whom I've written to in this book is so that none of us can claim ignorance. My hope is that once you read this book, it will be impossible to ignore the use of force continuum and its detrimental effects. I've also made clear how various people have been complicit in police torture. In addressing all of those people, all somehow connected to the scandal of police torture, it has not been my intent to make anyone feel alienated or defensive, angry, or inadequate. I want them to feel inspired and inventive, curious and empowered by what they now know. In reading my open letters to them, I hope you feel the same way. For social scientists interested in social justice in particular, I want them to feel hopeful because of what I have to ask. Join me in reimagining the role of police in our society. I've mentioned that the activist efforts in Chicago to divest public funds from excess policing towards community development have been underway for some time. Along these lines, a concrete step we can take is to divest our intellectual resources from reproducing a world based in fear to reproducing ways of doing research based on collaboration and trust. Might we use our training to develop in advance and realize community-oriented approaches that enhance the quality of life of vulnerable people? I believe we can also use our significant resources to advance such approaches towards making society more equitable and fair. I have a suggestion to make in this regard. As opposed to seeing the black box of torture as a device that inflicts pain or a concept to illustrate how knowledge is concealed or revealing a trove of information, perhaps we can use the black box to represent something else. Maybe the black box can be useful as a repository that we can fill with the fruits of our efforts to expose open secrets among all of us that maintain social inequality. If so, we would do well to listen to the torture survivors. 10 years ago, around the time that activists in Chicago began to host teach-ins, lectures, and other public events about the history of police torture, when reparations for the torture survivors were still just a seed beginning to grow, I attended a round table discussion in Chicago hosted by survivors of torture, at which they spoke about the political activism that might emerge from their suffering. Anthony Holmes, a man who had spent 30 years in prison after having been tortured by Burge, was asked what sort of public memorial would honor the victims of John Burge's wrath. Holmes replied that Burge's black box should serve as a memorial. Quote, "If you set that black box on a panel, a plateau, that's a memorial because that represents all of us, because we're the ones who went through that. We're the ones that were suffocated and shocked until we passed out and almost died from it. We're the ones that were pronged, shotgun stuck in the mouth, the whole 9 yards. The bottom line is that black box is key. That's what got Burge, that box. The box is everything." If you truly care about change, you must take heed of Holmes's words, especially the last one, everything. By discussing everything that the black box has meant to people of color in Chicago, I'm not trying to sensationalize their predicament or make it seem that they alone bear the brunt of some exceptional horror. My hope is that you, my reader, can learn from the city's tumultuous relationship with political corruption and police torture, even if it can, and no doubt will be argued, that what happens in Chicago is not entirely representative of the way police officers across the nation conduct themselves. Precisely because of the reality of Chicago streets, because of what has happened in them and what can happen again if that reality remains secret, the torture survivors insist that much can be learned from their experiences. They insist, in other words, that we must speak secrets out loud. We must give voice to this painful reality. This is the lesson of the torture survivors. They are helping, as James Baldwin once said, to reveal more about America to Americans than Americans wish to know. This is a model for social justice that we all must follow. Let us make the black box our repository of truth, not a box that is closed and guarded, but a box that we as a community have pried open, a box whose insides are now on display for all to see. By exposing the internal components of the machine, let us finally see where all the wires are connected. The wires connected to black criminal suspects have led to the police department and to the legal apparatus of Cook County. Let us see how all these wires are connected to the larger engine of fear. Much like the motion on the handle of Burgett's fiendish machine, cranking electricity into his victims, fear catalyzes police power and military might, causing people at the top and bottom of their respective chains of command to ignore their colleagues' crimes and to remain silent about what they knew. Fear of the other made it possible for torture to become routine as a part of interrogation in certain Chicago precincts. That same fear allowed the tentacles of torture to reach the shores of Guantanamo Bay. With this contraption splayed wide open, let us finally see how understanding police torture and taking concrete steps to prevent it requires us to dismantle fear at the root of this pernicious American practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that reading. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for joining us, coming back to Chicago to spend some time with us here. Where it started for you, and I want to come back to where it started for you, but first I want to jump into something that you mentioned. And there's a phrasing of it, but also I think an entire theorizing that happens in the book around the idea of the collective investment in fear, and not just the book itself, but also many of your articles around and about police torture, which we'll get into some of this in a second. And I'm struck by what you punch us in the face with right away. The collective investment in fear, the need for safety, which is at the root of the tree. This need for safety, which is born out of what you say is a frontier logic in the production of the other. And so I would love to hear you talk about that, about these roots, about this collective investment, about this history that gets us to the place of the torture tree.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I think the most concrete way that I can explain it is by going back to Andrew Wilson. And Andrew Wilson was the first person to sue the city claiming that he got tortured. And as early as the 1980s, he had evidence of torture inscribed on his body. And he went to great efforts to demonstrate that he was tortured. The problem was for him that he was also accused of killing 2 police officers. And so he was incarcerated for those crimes, and a jury heard him describe what was done to him. They heard him show the marks or describe the black box, the pain of the black box, the grinding of his teeth. They looked at photographs of his body before and after he was interrogated. And they believed that he deserved what the police did to him, right? And so they let his torturer off the hook, John Burge. And so the reason why I think that's important, because they believe that they should be more fearful of Andrew Wilson than the police officers who tortured him, even though they knew that there was evidence of his torture. And that decision, in many ways, allowed torture to continue in Chicago. It allowed John Burge to become more emboldened It allowed him to recruit other police officers to his A team, which systematically interrogated and tortured criminal suspects. And it allowed torture to go on within that particular precinct for at least 2 more decades, and hundreds of more torture victims as a result of that initial affair of Andrew Wilson. And so I really come back to this again and again in the book, because when I was talking to people, at first they would say, yes, torture is wrong, torture is always wrong, but then there would be these caveats of what if there's a terrorist, what if, all these exceptions that we've become inundated with as a society to make it seem acceptable. And all of those what ifs are rooted in fear. They're based in fear. They're based in feeling unsafe, right? And not realizing that that feeling is also producing more violence at the same time, right? And so that's why I'm very stark and very strong about why it's important to root out fear, and why it's important to take a principled and ethical stance on this idea that no one should ever be tortured, no matter what they've done. It seems simple, but it quickly gets unraveled when you talk about these complex contexts in which people are actually tortured.
When confronted with the realities of the crime, which we'll talk about in a second, which was likely committed.
Right.
All the evidence points in that direction. Because of the fear of these kinds of people who are likely to do these kinds of things, we see these sorts of practices, which gets to me, like how you come to that is interesting, and to me it has to do with your method, the way you approach the question to begin with. You said this in your lead up as you were reading the epigraph. You talked about thinking about things that were that the anthropologists are interested in, the everyday, the routine, the mundane, and so there's a tend to turn away from the spectacular. If you allow me to just riff on you, they tend to turn away from the spectacular, look for the routine, because it's only routine because it's somebody else's culture. It's only routine because they're a strange alien. But if you pay attention to what's routine among the group, if you don't take them for strange, then things that we might call spectacular aren't so spectacular. There's something like 40 million police stops a year, for example. You illustrate in the book how early policing interaction started for so many people in the book, and so I'm curious about the method to get at the mundane, the routine. You do focus groups, you do interviews, you comb the archives, and then in the writing of the book, the method of the writing, your decision is to write letters to the people who were impacted by, but also participated in or looked the other way. And so I'm wondering about what taking the experiences of these different constituencies seriously yields. Can you talk about the method, what taking those constituencies yield, and also what you hope to accomplish by looking at it from these different vantages?
Yeah, no, thanks, and that's a great question. I think I'm always interested in not just, as someone who writes about Black life, right? I'm always interested in not just like the empirical facts and the social problems, but also how they get represented, by producers of whether it be art or scholarship or what have you. How do we represent that, right? And particularly, how do we represent suffering? How do we represent trauma? In this case, how do we represent torture, right? And so I thought very carefully about this. For years, I didn't know how to write about this topic, because if I just say a quote to you of a torture survivor describing what happened to them, it will be very jarring. It will be very sensational. It will be very, it will seem exceptional in the way that we're talking about exception. But I didn't want to make it exceptional because it's embedded within these larger continuum of police practices that are quite routine, as you say, like quite mundane if you're Black and living in Chicago, particularly in the neighborhoods that I was doing research in. And so part of the biggest problem of the book was, how do I write about torture? How do I write about police torture? And I thought very hard about this, and particularly ways not to make it voyeuristic, not to make it exceptional. And I realized a couple things in that process. The first thing I noticed was that when the torture survivors were talking about what happened to them in community context, it never seemed voyeuristic and sensational. And I thought about, okay, like, why is that, you know? And eventually I realized that part of that was because they had an urgent message that they felt that they needed to say. It was to a particular group that they felt that they needed to hear that message. And it didn't stop with that message. There was a possibility of exchange. There was a possibility of questions like we have today, right? There was a possibility of adding to the conversation and the conversation building. And I wanted to carry that on through my own work. And for me, letters do all those things, right? When you write a letter, you're talking to someone very specific about something that you want them to know specifically. And there's a possibility of them saying, oh, but what about this? And then there's another realm of that, you know, another form of exchange. So the so-called expert's word is not the definitive word, right? It's just a point in time in an ongoing conversation. And I felt that with a topic like torture, it needed to be that way. It needed to be a point, a particular moment where we're having an ongoing conversation and people have the possibility of revising what they said. They have the possibility of adding to it, changing their minds. I wanted to reflect that within the book itself. And so that's part of the reason why I chose the letters. The other part is when I was interviewing people, when I was doing the focus groups, I would always ask people, who do you want to know this message? Like, who do you want, you know, I'm interviewing you, but who do you want to ultimately share these words, these insights with? And there was a number of people they mentioned: torture survivors, a younger generation of Chicagoans, politicians, activists, but they didn't mention scholars or anthropologists, you know what I mean? So what does it then mean that I write a book that scholars read, you know, like, so I wanted to be very explicit that, like, scholars choose to read this book, I hope they will, but I want to displace their gaze. I want to make them have to stand in the shoes of a young Chicago resident when reading this book, or stand in the shoes of Andrew Wilson when reading this book. And I think writing letters kind of allows you, it kind of displaces the reader a little bit. And so the only time where I address the reader is in what I just read, and that's at the end of the book, and that's very purposeful.
Can we talk audience for a second? you write to so many different kinds of people. The police commissioner, the mayor, these two babies you see standing on the corner, which is your baptism into the work, which I'll ask you about directly next, actually. How did writing to to the many heroes that show up in the book that resist, but from everyday heroes to folks that we've heard about, important attorneys, everyday, not every day, but activists on the ground. What did that do for how you wrote, like this switching of constituencies, if you will? Like when you think, often the question when people write a book is about the audience itself, and so it seems like you had 17 audiences. You're writing to multiple people. I wonder how that shaped you and your practice, your writing practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that I learned writing my first book, Renegade Dreams, which is about gang violence in Chicago. And I realized that, well, I developed an approach that I have carried on since through my work from that project, which is that, when I enter a community and work on a social problem, I enter it within a constellation of people who are already working on that problem from different vantages, right? And so the problem of gang violence or the problem of police violence, there's already many people working on that in different ways. And so part of what I have to do is say, what can I add to this collective effort if I am to also contribute to this? And I think I have things to add, but it's not clear if people in the community want me to write about it or how they want me to write about it. Or that's always a negotiation. And I realize that part of what I have to add is putting people in conversation that wouldn't necessarily be in conversation with each other, right? And so in my first book, it was, the people who work for the church might not necessarily talk to the people who work at juvenile hall, and they might necessarily talk to the former gang members, who've been paralyzed. But in putting all those conversations together, they can say, oh, actually there is something that we all agree on, or this is the reason why we don't speak, or these are the ways in which we could possibly speak. And so I think I take that as really a significant part of what I do. And so in terms of the audience question here, it's a similar vein. I want to put different people in conversation, put those perspectives in the same book, and where we can see the kind of resonances with the concerns people have, and you can understand why activists are frustrated with policing efforts, and why young people are bearing the brunt of the policing efforts, and they're not represented, and how they're conceiving of the issue, and how this lingers throughout the course of their lives, but also how those everyday experiences with policing ultimately make you understand torture better, make you understand how this could happen, and make you less fearful of someone like Andrew Wilson or someone like Anthony Holmes who's had this happen to them. Part of it is to destigmatize what it means to be tortured and destigmatize what it means to be a victim of police abuse, because there's a lot of shame that comes with that, a lot of questioning, what did I do wrong, why did I not do this, why did I not listen to this, internalizing blame. And so I think in revealing open secrets, part of it is to get all of that out in the open.
I wanted to ask you about the idea of internalizing blame. Something that comes across in your writing is the feeling of a situation. Whether you're describing, I think, in quite relevant detail, what's happening to someone as they're being tortured, which you make the argument that we need. I think you made that today too. Like made it very clear the things that we need, or if it's how the thing works. Like how does hiding what you call an open secret flow? You make the experience of participating in that really clear in your work, the feeling of it. It brings me to two places, and so I want to ask you about two things because I'm trying to be my time too. So thing one is, and I'm long-winded, but thing one is, your introduction to the field. You come to Chicago. You're here for 2 weeks, and then you see these two children being frisked by the police, and it harkens you back to your own experiences. And I wanted to ask you about that moment. It's a powerful moment, especially as you discuss what it meant to see your brothers and to be in that experience. And then the second question is how you get us into the experience of somebody not quite on the B team, right? Like the weak link. I'm thinking about your letter to Doris Bird. Talk to us about her and her role in it all, and how you were able to, in some ways, get inside of it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Well, I mean, I think the instances you describe where I'm looking at young people being stopped and frisked and talking about what that means, that actually came from a focus group experience where I was asking people, one of the questions I had was, what's your first memory of the police? All right? And the young people who I was talking to at first were very reluctant to speak to me. And they wouldn't speak to me until I told them my first memory of the police. And so I had to think about it. I was like, what is my first memory of the police, right? And then I returned to this moment. And so I had to wrestle with my own feelings and like, what does that mean? And in your own work, you talk about like proximity and thinking about the importance of proximity, because we're taught as ethnographers to be objective and that our personal background shouldn't matter and doesn't matter, but in these moments, it is all that matters. Mm-hmm. It is the condition of possibility that allows it actually to happen. If I'm not honest in that moment, I don't understand their perspective, or they don't tell me, you know what I mean? And so I kept it in the book, and I even put it in the film because of that, because it's the bridge that allows it to happen, but also allows me to gain insight into what they must have been feeling, but also insight into why I stopped in the first place and looked and tried to make sure that they were okay in the first place. If I hadn't had that experience, I don't know, I probably would have just kept walking or something, you know what I mean? So it's really kind of attuning ourselves to what we're able to see is very important in thinking about how that happens and why that happens. And the second question about Doris Bird, I was really fascinated by this group of Black police officers who were working within John Burge's precinct, who knew about torture, but were kind of excluded from working with Burge, and they heard about all these incidents, but they also felt marginalized, and it's a very tricky dynamic. But I wanted to say something through that, which is that oftentimes we have this excuse that becomes an alibi that oh, we didn't know, like we knew, but we didn't see everything, right? But within those absences, within those voids, there's a lot of what we actually do know. There's a whole structure, there's a whole kind of recreating that we can do based on the silences and the absences of what were actually there. And so I try to recreate the precinct based on those silences. And so what part of what we can know is that, people like Doris Bird and the B team, they would leave the precinct at a certain time because they didn't want to hear screams, right? So then we know, okay, this is the time where screams take place, or this is the time where the interrogations take place. We know that Birds tried to keep them at arm's length and demote them so that he could recruit people who were more sympathetic to his program. So we know, okay, what happens to certain people if they express that they don't agree with this. It's how exclusions take place within an institutional framework. We learn like what happens if you whistleblow within this. We learn why people don't whistleblow because they don't want to lose their retirement, or they don't, want themselves to get hurt. So there's actually a lot that we can learn from, the choices that people make. And so that's part of, more than anything, is what I was trying to show. But also I was trying to show I think we often think, if we only had, more black officers, or we only had, and part of it shows like why that's not the case necessarily. Like change doesn't necessarily happen like that. It takes a new kind of ethics and new kind of morals that define the culture of the space in order to truly have change, right? And so that's what I was trying to show.
That's powerful. My last question to you as we turn to the audience really has to do with the hope that's infused really from every chapter of the book. The book is powerful in your ability to describe some of the most awful circumstances that people have experienced, and it's also powerful in your ability to highlight the work of everyday people to resist these things, from officers who report and get demoted to officers who secretly send in letters to the work of important attorneys, to the activists of the We Charge Genocide movement and other activists. To even the discussion that you have with the participants in the focus group who land on, we want this story to be heard by, and then the X is almost always somebody who's building a world for the future, for the kids, for folks who've been through it so they know that they've been heard. It's always outward facing. Hope is so important. I would love for you to, in our part of the discussion, talking about how hope shows up in the book and why it's there. You also don't try to do a happy ending. That's not what you do, but how you use hope in the book.
Yeah, I think, I thought a lot about like what I place hope in, in writing about something like torture. And ultimately, like I don't place hope in like the idea that it'll get better over time. You know what I mean? Like, or even like the arc of justice bends, in a particular way naturally. But I do place hope in the activists, the people who are doing the work to change society. And so I feel like I have to discuss that. More generally, I think that also it's a question of like representation. I think that when you're writing about violence, trauma, torture, death, you're also writing about healing, life, recovery, repair. because they're two sides of the same thing, right? And I think that scholars, artists make mistakes when we say that, okay, our subject is violence, so we're only gonna represent the violence in the work, right? Because that's actually not how life is. You know, it's like if you're writing about violence, you know, some of the places where people talk about violence are like church or like spaces of healing or yoga studios or whatever. You know, as they're places of recovery where they're trying to get through the violence that has harmed them. So if you're not talking about that, you're flattening the existence, right? And so I was very aware of that, and I was very conscious of what is the underside of torture in these particular instances. Who are the other people who are working their way through this and working towards repair? And I feel like that actually paints a more accurate picture of the landscape that we exist in than trying to reduce it to violence, because I think it also has to do with, as a scholar, as an artist, what do you think motivates people to change society? Some people think that, okay, if I show them the most graphic image and the most like gut-wrenching thing, then the audience will be like, wow, I need to do something, right? But I think that presumes a lot of things about the audience. I think oftentimes that presumes that it's an audience that's very removed from this, that doesn't know anything about this, that has no context for this. But I don't presume that about my audience. I presume my audience knows about this, has some level of experience about this, may know someone who's been abused by the police, or may have been abused within their own institutional context, and therefore can relate to open secrets, right? And so I am trying to talk to them about what has worked as far as repair, what has worked as far as activism and mobilization and things like that. So it was important to actually include those things within this story.
Fantastic. Fantastic. We'd love to take any questions that you have. If you have a question, raise your hand. Please.
Isn't the elephant in the room when we discuss these issues is really morality, and it's the spiritual and moral problems that many extreme white conservatives who want to preserve their white privilege don't want to deal with the morality and the spirituality of the problem, because trying to ban books, especially that 1619 project, they don't want to deal with the heritage of slavery, and then following upon that, the heritage of segregation, and now the heritage of incarceration. They don't want to feel guilty. And that's why they're trying to shield their children from something like the 1619 project. But that goes to the very heart of the problem. All problems follow from slavery, follow from segregation, follow from incarceration. They don't want to deal with the moral dimensions. They want to put it in terms of power. And power with the exercise of power without any consideration of the morality of how power is exercised.
Yeah, no, I think that's a huge part of it and a huge part of the story. And part of that is the decontextualization of these particular issues related to crime and violence. And when you decontextualize them, you make it seem as though it's solely based on an individual's actions or something like that. So therefore, if someone is abused by the police, the question becomes, well, what did they do?
Right.
Right? And it's a way of not looking at these systemic issues. And so part of what I'm trying to do is put it back into that context within all of the dimensions that I hear referencing here, which is critically important because this is part of the wider movement as well. And so I talk about in the beginning of the book how another inspiration for me in writing this book was the fact that the survivors of police torture won a reparation ordinance in 2015. And part of that was to teach the history of police torture in public schools. And the inclination to teach the history of public schools has precisely to do with the fact that, you know, it's the counter to banning books. It's the idea that we have to learn about this history, know that it's rooted in a kind of long-standing subjugation of Black people. And this is why I not only try to write to young people within the context of the book, but also why I created an animated film as well, because I knew the book alone is not going to reach that constituency. And so it's important to find various ways along many dimensions to address this problem, because it's the huge elephant in the room, so to speak. It's what kind of systematically blocks issues like this from gaining traction politically, and for everyone, not just Black students, but from white students and places other than Chicago, from learning about this history. So it's vitally important.
We have time for another question if anyone has one. Please.
What was the hardest part for you about writing this book, given the depth of the topic?
Yeah. I think the hardest part was just figuring out how to write about torture, because it's hard to know like how much people need to know in order to understand the full scope of it. And on the one hand, you don't want to sanitize it, because if you sanitize it, you kind of you don't get a sense of the horror of it. But if you describe the horror fully, you turn people off. And so it's a really delicate balance that, you know, it's impossible to always do successfully, but you have to try when doing an important topic like this. So that was definitely the hardest part, because it also has implications for, you know, how people understand it, what you're saying and what, you know. Like on the one hand, it's vitally important for a lawyer, for instance, to show the scars of someone being tortured in the case, because they say, like, this is how we know what the torture device looked like. This is how we know what it, you know, its impact. But how does that translate into my own work? Do I reproduce that, or do I talk about it in a different way? And also, along with that, there's an issue of talking about it accurately, but still knowing that there are certain things that exceed even the framework of torture, right?
Good.
So it's like, even with the scars, what if you're not scarred, but the same thing happened to you, and it's mentally, you know, so how do you talk about that without putting that on a hierarchy with physical pain? You know, there is, along those lines, there is, of the torture survivors, of the cases that are proven within the record, probably like 99% of them are black men, you know? So what does that mean for like black women who are interrogated? The category of torture doesn't include rape or sexual assault necessarily. That's like its own category. So that's why a lot of women are excluded from the torture survivor category, right? So how do we understand that in the context of torture, that without placing it in a hierarchy? So there's certain questions like that where they're just, because of the way that the terms of debate are shaped, you can sometimes inherit those terms and those categories. Like torture is like a legal category that means specific things and doesn't mean anything. But then, where it doesn't mean other things, but then that creates its own violence and the exclusions, right? So the hardest part is just figuring out actually how to write about torture.
Well, let's thank Professor Ralph.
Thank you all.
Thank you both for joining us. If you haven't purchased your copy of Torture Letters yet, you can do so here. You can make your purchases at either of these counters. Halfway Home and Renegade Dreams are also available. Thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon. We hope to see you soon.
Thank you.